It's loading. Here we go. It's loading. Welcome. Welcome, everyone, to Medical Mondays with Dr. O. I am Dr. Toyin Okwesomi. I'm a family practitioner who also treats HIV and substance use disorder in Maryland. And I get excited about Mondays, even though this December is going to be interesting. I think we're going to have 2 weeks straight off towards the end of the year, but we still have at least 2, 3 weeks that we can do some learning. Tonight, we're going to talk about a subject that is becoming so important in our community because it has to do with infertility. And we have the blessing, the honor of having Attorney Yifat Shaltiel,
Yes.
who we've been discussing if it should be uh, Esquire or JD. I still go with the Juris Doctor, but we're excited to have her talk to us about the scope on surrogacy. And without much ado, I'm going to yield to Honorable Attorney uh, Sh- Attorney Shaltiel to take the floor. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much,
And
Dr.
welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here with all of you and to tell you just an overview of surrogacy. I'll just start by introducing myself. My name is Yifat Shaltiel. I am a surrogacy attorney. I've been an attorney for 20 years plus. And surrogacy is all I practice. I am also author of Save Money on Surrogacy. So this is a topic that I think all the time about. Um, I am CEO and founder of Surrogate Steps, a surrogacy agency, and I was co-chair for the Reproductive Health Law Committee for the Women's Bar Association for well over a decade. And I'm still a board member of the Finger Lakes Women's Bar Association as well. And I have done a lot in the surrogacy world, including giving legal, oh, thank you, including giving legal classes to attorneys and judges about surrogacy, including being guest speaker at Cornell Law School, for example. And I also have been interviewed by a lot of various media outlets, MSNBC, Fox News, The Wall Street Journal. And I'm just excited to finally make it to Dr. O and to be here with all of you. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to give you an overview of surrogacy. And hopefully, let me minimize this. And at the end, I am more than happy to also take any questions. By the way, you can also find me on YouTube, Facebook, any social media outlet as the surrogacy attorney. So with that, I would love to get started. Let me just make sure. Oops. Okay, so first I want to discuss what we are going to cover. So we are going to cover what surrogacy even is. We're going to cover the two different types of surrogacy arrangements that we can have. And believe it or not, surrogacy is not always compensated. So we will discuss what it looks like to be a compensated surrogate versus to be a compassionate surrogate, and also why people even proceed with surrogacy. We will discuss and review the medical aspects of surrogacy, as well as legal considerations, psychological considerations, and other non-medical, non-legal screening considerations that you have to or you might want to do when you're dealing with a surrogacy arrangement. So first, let's start by what is a surrogate? So, a surrogate is a woman who agrees to become pregnant through assisted reproductive technology, and she carries a child for the intended parents. So, it is very important that we emphasize that it is done through assisted reproductive technology. Okay, so surrogacy in the biblical sense is not what surrogacy is today. You have to have medical technology involved. And as I said, we have two different types of surrogacy arrangements. So we're going to have traditional surrogacy, and then there is gestational surrogacy. So, traditional surrogacy is where the surrogate does agree to become pregnant for the intended parents. She will carry the child for them, but the child is also using her own eggs. That means that she is genetically related to the child. So, the surrogate herself is both the egg donor as well as the surrogate. And again, just to emphasize this, you do need the assistance of a physician with a fertility clinic. Now, the type of people that do traditional surrogacy, they're usually someone that the parents know very, very well. So it's usually going to be a family member or a very close friend or some type of relative. There are, of course, going to be risks associated with traditional surrogacy, as you might imagine. So, this is going to include emotional and psychological risks because the surrogate is carrying a child that is genetically related to her. So, she is the birth mother, and she is technically giving up the baby that is genetically hers. So there might be a lot of emotional and psychological risk that a parent is going to be taken there because she might not want to do something like that once she's holding the baby. Now, in addition, there's going to be the legal risks as well, because the surrogate is also the egg donor because she's genetically related to the baby. So it's going to vary from state to state, and I'm referring to the US. It will differ from state to state, but generally speaking, you're going to need an adoption in these type of situations because the surrogate will actually need to give up her parental rights and will be initially recognized as the legal mother, and through an adoption will be given the child to the parents. And then there is gestational surrogacy. So this is what is most common. So when people refer to surrogacy, usually they are referring to gestational surrogacy. And this is going to be what we will mainly talk about today and cover. So again, most intended parents, they're going to be proceeding with a gestational surrogate. As you can imagine, because the surrogate is not related to the child that she's carrying, there's a lot less psychological and legal risks involved. So here, the surrogate is agreeing to become pregnant for the intended parents, but she will never be genetically related to the baby that she's carrying. So this is going to be an arrangement where the intended parents are creating their own embryos, and they're going to create their embryos. They're either going to use their sperm and their egg, or they're going to use a sperm or egg donor, and then they'll create their embryos from that, and then use that to do an embryo transfer to the surrogate's uterus. Now, even with whether someone is traditional or compassionate, when you're traditional or gestational, when you're looking at surrogacy, there are also two different types of surrogates. So there are surrogates who are going to be compassionate, and then there's going to be compensated surrogates. Now, that is the majority of the cases where surrogates are in fact compensated. In a compassionate surrogacy, the surrogate is an altruistic surrogate, so she's not compensated. So this is going to be a surrogate who's carrying the child for the intended parents, but she's not going to receive any type of compensation, whether in kind or monetary. A compassionate surrogate is still going to receive some money, but it's not going to be in form of compensation. So she's going to receive reimbursements that can include medical reimbursements or any travel expenses that she might have associated with the surrogacy. She might have lost wages that she will need reimbursed as well if she has to go to doctor's appointments, things like that. But these are going to be reimbursements and not considered compensation. And the idea is that we don't want the surrogate to have any out-of-pocket expenses for doing a surrogacy journey for the intended parents. So this is the intended parents' baby. It is a baby that she's caring for them, and they will be financially responsible for any out-of-pocket expenses. So in compassionate surrogacy, the surrogate is typically going to be someone who is a family member, a relative, or a very close friend of the intended parents. Those tend to be usually the type of surrogates that end up doing compassionate surrogacy. And then we have compensated surrogates. And as I said, this is going to be the majority of surrogates. They will be compensated. So this is where the surrogate is going to be carrying the child for the intended parents. And during that journey, she's going to be receiving compensation for different various things that she does during the journey. Now, in cases where the surrogate is a family member or a close friend, usually, not always, but usually the intended parents will still want to provide some form of compensation to the surrogate, but these are going to be cases where they do pay her a lot less than what a compensated surrogate usually would receive. So they will still usually want to give her some money, but it's not going to be what is typical in the industry if a surrogate is being matched through a surrogacy agency, for example. And there are going to be a lot of different compensation types that the surrogate does receive at various stages of the journey. So, for example, she might receive certain compensation when she undergoes an embryo transfer, and then during the pregnancy itself, so long as she's continuing to maintain a pregnancy, she would also receive compensation as well. And what is this compensation for? So is the surrogate actually getting paid to give up a baby to the parents or to relinquish her parental rights of the child to the parents? So the answer is no. The surrogate is never, ever compensated for giving up any type of parental rights or for giving a baby to the intended parents. So she's not being compensated for that. What she is getting compensation for are the additional living expenses that she's going to have due to the pregnancy. She's getting paid for the additional time that she has to take to handle certain things during the pregnancy, such as medical appointments, things like that. She's getting paid for the pain and suffering that she undergoes in a pregnancy, as well as for the risk that she's taking in pregnancy as well. And I think we forget that there is definitely the risk of death when it comes to pregnancy. It is, many times we see very positive outcomes, but death is still a risk. So that is definitely taken into consideration, the various risks that she is taking in undergoing a pregnancy for the intended parents. Now, who can be a surrogate? Can anyone who wants to be a surrogate be a surrogate? So the answer is no. You have to qualify to be a surrogate. So the different qualifications of a surrogate will vary from fertility clinic to fertility clinic. And the surrogate will need to be qualified by the fertility clinic for the clinic to say, yes, you can proceed as a surrogate for these intended parents. So some of these qualifications can include that she has to have at least one prior pregnancy and child. There is usually a limit as to how many prior pregnancies she was allowed to have. There is also usually a limit as to the number of miscarriages that she has had. And there's usually a limit as to the BMI, which is the ratio that is taken between height and weight, and as well as an age limitation as well. So in addition to all this, clinics will have a lot of other qualifications that she must meet. So for example, she can't have had a prior high-risk pregnancy. The idea is that we don't want to ever qualify a surrogate who is going to be a high risk and place her life in danger or the life of the child in danger. So given that this is surrogacy and there is a lot of planning involved, we want to make sure that we are taking all the risks into consideration and not putting anyone's life at risk. Now, ASRM has also put forth requirements for a surrogate as well. These are just guidelines that ASRM does put forth as to what they tell fertility clinics that they should take into consideration when qualifying a surrogate. Now, the fertility clinics don't have to listen to this because it is a guideline, but many clinics do follow ASRM guidelines, and some clinics even have more stricter guidelines than this. So some of the guidelines include that the surrogate does have to be between 21 and 45 years old. She is not allowed to have more than 5 previous deliveries, and she's not allowed to have more than 3 prior C-sections. Now, in terms of surrogate screening, there is obviously the medical screening involved. There's a lot of the legal that we'll get into in a minute. But in addition to that, there's going to be other screening that intended parents are going to want to do when they are looking to work with a surrogate. And if you are working with a surrogacy agency that is matching you, like Surrogate Steps, for example, then we're going to be doing all of these screening in advance, and it is pretty important. So for example, you want to make sure that the surrogate does not have a criminal background. So you're going to want to do a criminal background check for the surrogate and anyone who's over the age of 18 years old that resides in her home, including a spouse or partner if they have one. Now, if they have a significant other that does not reside with them, you're going to still want to do the screening of that criminal background check of that person as well. And the fertility clinic will also require that person to undergo various blood tests that is required by the FDA as well, because if it is an intimate partner. We also do an in-person home study investigation. So home study inspection is very important because reading medical records is one thing. Having a surrogate go to a fertility clinic to undergo various medical testing is also very important. But it is important to visit the surrogate's home and make sure that it doesn't smell like smoke. Make sure that there's no signs of alcohol abuse, drug abuse. Make sure that the environment is going to be a safe environment, both for the surrogate and for the potential baby as well that she will be carrying. So that is very important. We also do a DMV record check. So you want to make sure that the surrogate doesn't have things like reckless driving. And we do want to get an OBGYN or MFM medical clearance as well as physical clearance for the surrogate. So you want to make sure that the doctor that knows her history is basically signing off saying that they know her history and they believe that she will be a great surrogate without taking any undue risk to herself or a potential child. And psychological evaluation is very, very important. This should include a personality test as well for the surrogate and her spouse if she has one. So why surrogacy? Why would anyone want to have a baby through surrogacy? So there's a lot of various reasons why people go through surrogacy, and one of them is the infertility community, which we'll cover in more detail in a second. There are also individuals that have a high medical risk and they cannot carry a pregnancy on their own. So, for example, if a woman has diabetes, it is too risky for her to proceed with a pregnancy on her own. So, she would have to seek the services of a surrogate. Clearly, there's the same sex community and single parents as well, which I keep seeing a rise in this every year, where we have more and more single intended dads proceeding with surrogacy just because they haven't found a partner and they always wanted a family and they don't want to wait. And they proceed with surrogacy as a single parent by choice. Now, in terms of the infertility community, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, ASRM, defines infertility as a disease of the male or female reproductive tract which prevents the conception of a child or the ability to carry a pregnancy to delivery. And there are a lot of various infertility reasons. Most frustrating of them all is unexplained infertility. That's what I had. I got into surrogacy in the first place because of my own personal experience with infertility. That's how I ended up doing what I'm doing and helping other people have families like I did my own family. So yes, unexplained infertility is very, very frustrating. But sometimes we just don't know why we keep having miscarriages or just unable to conceive at all. And so we proceed with a surrogacy. Other examples of infertility is just based on low sperm count, poor egg quality, or inadequate embryo quality, or other medical issues. As I stated before, for example, someone with diabetes, they would need to proceed with surrogacy. So, in order to even think about surrogacy, you're going to need embryos. And again, we are talking about gestational surrogacy because in traditional surrogacy, there are the surrogate is the egg donor as well. So there's a couple different ways to proceed with that. But medically speaking, when we're talking about a gestational surrogate, a gestational carrier, we are going to need embryos. And embryo, in terms of the embryo creation, I get this question a lot from my clients. They're always asking me if the genetics of the surrogate is going to in fact affect the genetics of their baby. So when you're looking at an egg donor, for example, it is very important to select the egg donor that maybe you want the egg donor to look like you, because the genetics of your baby will definitely be associated with the egg. But is the gestational surrogate also someone that will be passing genetics to the baby? And the answer is no. So the genetics of the surrogate is not going to affect the baby. What affects the genetics of your baby will be based on the source of the sperm and egg and not based on the gestational carrier herself. And I put a cute little cartoon there for you guys as well. Now, when you are creating your embryos, you're going to have various options. So we're going to need an egg and a sperm, and we're based on that, we are going to have various options. So we can use the egg and sperm of the intended parents, we can use a known donor, or we can use an anonymous donor. So In terms of a known sperm donor, usually known sperm donors are someone that is a relative or a close friend. In those arrangements, you will need a legal contract between the donor and the intended parents, the recipients. If you are proceeding with an anonymous sperm donor, it's pretty simple. You usually work with a sperm bank, and any contract that you have is going to usually be with the sperm bank itself. When you're looking at egg donors, it is a bit more of a more rigorous process, I guess, because an egg donor has to undergo an entire egg retrieval in order to donate her eggs. Typically, when you're looking at a known donor, you are looking at either someone who is your friend or a relative. Donor agencies, there are egg donor agencies that you can work with as well that will have known egg donors. Some people do want the option of knowing who the egg donor is in the future in case they want to maintain contact with them or even have their child potentially be introduced to the donor at some point. So if that is something that the parents want, you can definitely, there are egg donor agencies that will do that. And in known egg donor cases, you will still need a legal contract between the egg donor as well as the recipients, the intended parents. And then there is anonymous egg donor, which is typically the fertility clinics will have options of anonymous egg donors that intended parents can select from. Or you can use an egg donor agency as well that can also introduce you to, they usually have a database of various egg donors that you can select from. Or you can also have a situation where it's semi-anonymous, where you'll have some type of contact, but it's all going to go through the agency. So there are various options if that is something that the intended parents want. Now, once you create your embryos, you're going to need your surrogate. And when it comes to your surrogate, one of the things that you definitely have to consider are the legal considerations because the law is so different. Even in the United States, the law is different from state to state. And just worldwide, the law is so different from country to country. So you're going to want to know what law is going to actually apply to your surrogacy arrangement and your surrogacy journey. So first, we're going to need to ask, is surrogacy even legal? So what state are we working with if we are in the US, if you're doing it internationally? Like you will want to figure out which laws are going to apply to your surrogacy journey and is it legal in that place to actually proceed with surrogacy. You will also need a gestational carrier agreement. There's a lot of various names for these agreements. Sometimes it's referred to as gestational surrogacy agreement or surrogacy agreement. So this is going to be an agreement between the intended parents and the surrogate where everything in the surrogacy arrangement, all the legal responsibilities, all the expectations of the parties are going to be stated in that agreement. And then we're going to have a parentage order. We are going to need to figure out how are we going to make sure that the intended parents in the surrogacy journey are going to be considered and seen as the legal parents of their child and that there is going to be no other legal parent for that child. And sometimes that might involve an adoption. So if you are working with a surrogacy agency like Surrogate Steps, for example, we will do all of that for you before we even match you. So before we match intended parents, we're already doing all this and coming up with an entire legal map as to how we're going to make sure that that the intended parents are the only legal parents of their child and that they have parental rights. And this also applies to the surrogates, by the way. So surrogates also don't want to get stuck with a baby. They want to make sure that the parents will, in fact, take the baby And believe it or not, a lot of the times the questions I get from the parents is, how do we make sure that the surrogate isn't going to run away with our baby? And then the same thing with the surrogate. How do I make sure that the intended parents are not going to leave me with the baby? So it's funny that that is the worst fear of both parties. But if you're working with a surrogacy agency, this is something that's already figured out way in the beginning. If you're not, this is something that you will definitely want to figure out in the beginning of the journey. So, in terms of international surrogacy, and the focus today is going to be mainly in the US, but if you are working with a different country, you do want to make sure that it is legal in the country that you are working with. So, some countries, France, Germany, just as an example, they ban surrogacy altogether. Other countries, they just regulate surrogacy. And some countries, things are still up in the air. It's a gray area and unknown and still a little bit tricky to proceed. So I think with time, things will get more clearer. But in the meantime, any country that you decide to work with, my best advice is make sure that the intended parents have a surrogacy attorney in that country to make sure that their legal rights are going to be protected so that they know how they're going to be seen and seen as the legal and the only parents of their child. And in the US, as you can see, I put a map here. This is a map provided in the resources at surrogatesteps.com. So at surrogatesteps.com, we have a lot of free resources for parents. This is one of them, which is a map of the US. And if you click on any part or any state, it will give you a list of attorneys in that state. And it will also give you the law of that particular state. So we just talked about other countries. Just in the US alone, you can see how the law is so different. So, the red, for example, Nebraska and Louisiana, surrogacy is completely banned. You can't do surrogacy in those states. Other states are wonderful, like California, Nevada, Colorado. As you can see, other states, there are some differences. It will depend on the specific scenario that we are working with. It can depend on whether the intended parents are straight or if they're heterosexual or same-sex couple, if they are legally married or not, if they are genetically related, if they're a single parent. Some of the hardest journeys to work with are actually the single moms who don't have a genetic connection to their baby. So it is very, very important to know the law in the state that you are working with and to make sure you have an attorney in the state that will apply to the surrogacy arrangement. Now, as I mentioned before, it is very, very important to have a surrogacy agreement in place. And if you are doing surrogacy in the US, all the clinics that I'm familiar with will not allow you to proceed with an embryo transfer without first having what is referred to as a legal clearance to make sure that all the parties did in fact execute a surrogacy agreement. And again, this is also referred to as a gestational carrier agreement or sometimes referred to as gestational surrogacy agreement. And what I did here for you is just mention a few things that are included in a surrogacy agreement. And it really, it's usually a very long document. It's like over 60 pages. So it's a very long document. It includes things that only attorneys usually think of, but I'll just reiterate some of them here for you so people know to think about them when they're entering into a surrogacy arrangement. So, one of them is that the surrogate and the intended parents will need to first agree on how many embryos they want transferred at each embryo transfer. So, usually people are going to do just one, they will agree to one embryo per transfer. but sometimes they will agree to two, which gives you a higher likelihood of twins. Now, majority of clinics do not allow for two, so that is why many people will do one, but some clinics will allow two, especially if the quality of the embryos are not very good. They will allow you to do more than one. So that is part of what will be included in that agreement. How many embryos everybody is understanding that they will do per embryo transfer. Another one is going to be how many embryo cycles we're going to have. So just because you do an embryo transfer doesn't mean that that embryo transfer is going to be successful. So because of that, you do want to agree to at least more than one embryo transfer to have a higher success and a higher chance at pregnancy. So typically people are going to agree to do 3 embryo transfers for at least 12 months during the duration of the surrogacy arrangement. So within a 12-month period from when everyone signs a surrogacy agreement, they will agree to at least during that time try at least 3 times to obtain a pregnancy. And then the term of the contract, so how long will the contract be good for? When would the contract potentially terminate? So for example, if a surrogate is no longer medically cleared by the doctor, maybe there was a miscarriage and the doctor says she's no longer really cleared, that is going to automatically terminate the contract. And obviously, if money's involved, we have to include it in the contract. So compensation, reimbursements potentially not just to the surrogate, but to a companion. So a surrogate, if she's traveling, she usually will travel with a companion, or if she's going into delivery, there's usually going to be a companion that goes with her. So there's going to be reimbursements to them as well, things like lost wages, as we have stated earlier. Any decisions involving any potential decision that has to do with termination of a pregnancy or selectively reducing a pregnancy, those intentions and everyone's understanding will have to be in that surrogacy agreement. Now, I will say that is going to be something that is always going to be up to the surrogate to make that final decision, because it is her body and no judge is ever going to allow the intended parents to do anything otherwise. So it's going to be up to the surrogate. The intended parents have to understand that, but it is very important that everyone is still on the same page so that everybody knows what decision would be made if a decision like that does need to be made. And then there is going to be, if the surrogate is going to agree to do an amniocentesis for purpose of genetically testing the fetus during the pregnancy. If there's going to be an invasive procedure, how is that going to be handled? The medical instructions that the surrogate is going to agree to adhere to. And all of the financial obligations that the intended parents are going to be obligated to the surrogate must be in there, including even not just to the surrogate, including making sure that the hospital bills are going to be the financial responsibility of the intended parents, for example. And if there's a breach, then we need to know how we're going to handle that breach. So if someone does breach the agreement, how is that going to be handled? And of course, leave it up to the attorneys to think of this one, that, well, what happens if the intended parents both die? What happens in case of their death? Who is going to be responsible for the child? Will there be a legal guardian in place? Do the parents have to have a will in place? And same thing with a surrogate. If a surrogate ends up in a coma, for example, is she going to agree to stay in a coma until the baby is able to be safely delivered? And just a few other things. If the surrogate loses a reproductive organ, what will happen in that case? As we said before, pregnancy is not a zero risk. There is going to be a lot of risks associated with surrogacy, and pregnancy, death being one of them, and also potentially losing a reproductive organ. So that will be addressed in the contract as well. And whether or not the surrogate will be allowed to travel outside of her state or even the country, and if so, under what terms. So from the slide that I just showed you with just the US alone, how the law is different in every state, we don't want a situation where a surrogate from California with great state laws who would potentially end up in, let's say, Nebraska, and then deliver a baby in Nebraska. That's going to be a huge problem because Nebraska bans surrogacy. In fact, there was a case, this was a while ago, but there was a case out of Connecticut where the surrogate did have a dispute with the intended parents. It was a dispute over termination of a pregnancy, and the surrogate did not want to terminate the pregnancy. And the surrogate in Connecticut decided to go to Michigan. Now, Michigan today has great laws. They just recently passed great laws, and they have great laws in Michigan today. But at the time, it was banned in Michigan. So these laws are always changing. And at the time, it was banned. So she went to Michigan, where in Michigan, she was considered the legal mother because they banned surrogacy and they would not recognize a surrogacy agreement. So she was then seen as the legal parent. And in that particular case, she did agree to put up the baby up for adoption. And the intended father, because his sperm was used, was still the legal father. So he also agreed to the adoption, and the baby ended up getting adopted. But yeah, it is very important as to where the surrogate is going to deliver the baby, because typically, not always, but typically where the baby is going to be born will be the law that will apply to the surrogacy arrangement. So again, talk to a surrogacy attorney and make sure you know the law that's going to apply to that particular surrogacy arrangement. But for that reason, it is very important whether or not we're going to agree that the surrogate travel at certain times during the pregnancy. So usually it tends to be that usually the last trimester, the surrogate agrees not to travel outside of the state and really to stay close by the hospital where the baby will be delivered. Also, we're going to be covering in that surrogacy agreement things like what is going to happen in case of a miscarriage. So how is that going to, what will happen in that type of situation? And will the intended parents be the first ones outside of a medical professional to hold their baby? And will the intended parents be allowed to be in the delivery room? Will the surrogate be allowed to also see the baby before the baby is discharged from the hospital to the intended parents? So at this stage of the game, when you're looking at the delivery stage, the intended parents will usually already have a parentage order in place, and they will be recognized as the legal parents. So in those cases, the baby will definitely be discharged to the intended parents because they are the legal parents. However, the surrogate many times has little children, and her kids also saw her carry a pregnancy, and now there's going to be no baby to bring home. And it really helps, psychologically speaking, for her family as well, to see the baby before the baby is being discharged from the hospital. So it's interesting that there's a lot of actually psychological components to this as well. But surrogacy, especially here in the US, the people who want to be surrogates are many times people who really want to do something good for someone else. They know someone, for example, who went through infertility, and that really opened up their eyes to surrogacy, and now they want to help someone else. One of my clients, for example, who is a surrogate, was adopted. So her mother had infertility, she was adopted, and now she, as someone who was adopted, wants to give back to someone else and has decided to do that through surrogacy. So, because of that, they don't want to feel that this is a business transaction. So, being able to see the baby before the baby is discharged to the parents at the hospital is usually very important for surrogates, especially here in the US. And we also put in the contract how much contact is expected by all the parties to have during the pregnancy as well as post the delivery. So during the pregnancy, there's going to have to be communication because the surrogate needs to tell the parents who, when she has an appointment, when there's an ultrasound, she has to keep them updated about the pregnancy. Now, and for that reason, also, we don't do anonymous surrogacy. So, as we discussed before, you can have an anonymous sperm donor, you can have an anonymous egg donor, but we don't do anonymous surrogacies. So, the parents and the surrogate do know each other. They will get to know each other. And that communication during the pregnancy is very important. Now, communication after the delivery, so if it's not a family friend, a relative, will there be communication after the delivery? So we put what the parties' expectations are in the contract as well. And just so you know, typically speaking, surrogates here in the US do want some kind of contact, even if it's just one picture once a year on the child's birthday, just to know that the child is doing well and is happy. And it's not something that they're taking to social media. Confidentiality is another big part of this. I didn't put it here, but that's also covered in the surrogacy agreement. So they do keep things very confidential. They can't go onto Facebook, for example, and post pictures of the baby, the surrogacy baby. But they do want to know that the baby's okay and happy and doing well. So many times the parents will either, if they don't keep even closer contact, they'll at least at minimum do that. And sometimes the parents also want the option to give the baby breast milk, in which case the surrogate will decide if that is something she's willing to do. And if she is, then we put that in the agreement as well, that she will agree to pump breast milk for them. And the parents obviously will be responsible for the cost involving transportation. Now, also, as I stated before, parentage, that is how we make sure that the intended parents are the legal parents of their child. That is different than a birth certificate, and sometimes people do get that confused. So you have to have a parentage order in order to be able to have the correct birth certificate. So the parentage order is different also than a birth certificate, because a birth certificate is just an administration. It's very administrative. It's an administrative document, where a parentage order is actually a court order document. So it actually weighs more than a birth certificate, legally speaking. So the intended parents have to have a parentage order, sometimes referred to as a birth order. And depending on the state, because every state is different, sometimes it is done via a birth order, sometimes it's done via a post-birth order. One state that I'm familiar with, Illinois, will do everything just by an administrative proceeding, but usually it's going to go through the courts, and it's going to be a court order document that will declare the intended parents as the legal parents of their child. Now, that is something that is typically started at 14 weeks of pregnancy. That's how we do it at Surrogate Steps at our agency. Once a surrogate is 14 weeks along, we start that birth order proceeding. So and again, the law just varies from state to state. So sometimes that might require us to first get a custody order for the parents. But as soon as that baby is born, all the legal rights are going to be with the intended parents, because there will be medical decisions, legal decisions that need to be made for the baby. And the intended parents are going to be making those decisions, such as, for example, the type of vaccinations that the baby is going to receive. Also, who's going to name the baby? That is a legal decision that the intended parents are going to have. So the hospital is going to have all this information, And they are going to make sure that they look to the intended parents to make all of those decisions. And those will also include things like when a baby's born, they will receive a bracelet, and the name on the bracelet for the baby will match the bracelet that the intended parents have. It will not match the bracelet that the surrogate has because she's not the legal parent. Now, once you have that birth order is sent to the Department of Health, and it is the Department of Health that issues the birth certificate. And again, of course, every Department of Health has to be different, but they will issue an amended birth certificate. So that is going to vary by state to state as to how fast the parents can get a copy of that birth certificate. But that birth certificate is going to have the intended parents as the legal parents of their child. And it's not going to have the name of the surrogate anywhere on that birth certificate, just the names of the intended parents. Now, with international parents, there are other considerations. So I'm not referring to surrogacy outside of the US. I'm referring to when we are working with a surrogate in the US, but we have our parents outside of the US coming to do surrogacy in the US. So the other consideration is that, as we've said, you have to have a surrogacy attorney here in the US in the state that is going to apply the laws that will apply to your surrogacy arrangement. But in addition to that, whatever country you are coming from, you're going to want to consult with a surrogacy attorney in your home country because you want to make sure that there isn't going to be any issues with you being recognized as the legal parent of your child in your home country. So here in the US, you're going to have that birth order and eventually your birth certificate for your baby, and you will be recognized as the legal parent here in the US. But when you take your baby home, we want to make sure that you're recognized as the legal parent in your home country as well. So we have to also, in the home country, make sure that we consult with a surrogacy attorney there. And we're also going to want to consult with an immigration attorney in regards to citizenship. So basically, when you're taking your baby home, when the intended parents go back to their home country, we want to make sure that they're not going to have any problem crossing over to their home country and passing customs with their baby to be able to actually take their baby home. And you will definitely need a passport for your baby if you are traveling outside of the US. And the only way to get that passport is to first have your birth certificate for your baby. And that is also something that if someone is coming internationally to do surrogacy here in the US, something that you do need to take into consideration in the very beginning when you're matching with the surrogate, when you're determining which law will apply to your surrogacy journey, because as I said, every Department of Health is different in terms of how long they can take to issue that correct birth certificate. It's referred to as an amended birth certificate, but really it looks just like the original birth certificate. So how long is it going to take for you to be able to obtain a passport? So if you are working, just to give you an example, New York, for example, will take sometimes 4 months, sometimes 6 months to provide that birth certificate. So typically with international community, they don't want to be stuck here for 6 months. They want to go back home. So New York isn't a good option. New York isn't a good option for international parents for other reasons as well. But that is one good reason why that would not be the case. But again, every state is different. So some states it'll be a couple of days, some states a week, some states a few weeks. You definitely will want to prepare for that in advance. So in conclusion, the best I can really say, if someone that is proceeding with surrogacy, is that there is a lot of planning involved, okay? Because this is a very complicated area. And even today, I barely touched the surface. So it is a complicated area. If someone wants to proceed with surrogacy, there is a lot of planning involved, and that planning should start with the surrogacy experts. So you're going to want to work with a reproductive endocrinologist, with a fertility clinic, and especially if you're an international couple or individual, you will want to take into consideration even which clinic to work with. Because if you're proceeding with surrogacy in the US, you will want to create your embryos in the US and you'll want to work with a US clinic. Because if you're creating your embryos outside of the US, you might not be able to get them into the US, depending on the clinic that we are working with. So, again, a lot of considerations. You'll want to work with a surrogacy attorney. You'll want to figure out which attorneys you need to work with. So if you are in the US, if your surrogate is here in the US, you're going to want a surrogacy attorney in the state that is going to, where the laws will apply to your entire surrogacy arrangement. If you are an international parent, you also want a surrogacy attorney in your home country. And it is, of course, if you're working with a surrogacy agency, they're going to make sure that all of your bases are covered, which is what we do here at Surrogate Steps. So with that, I will open it up to any questions. You can also send me questions if you like at ys@surrogatesteps.com. And again, you can find me on everywhere at the Surrogacy Attorney, on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok even. And yeah, with that, I'll turn it back over to Dr. O and open it up to questions.
Wow. Thank you so much. I learned so much
Oh,
in
my
that.
pleasure.
Thank you. Appreciate you. Um, Before I go to, I have some questions for you. And if
Yeah.
you have questions, please remember to raise your hands or put it in the chat box. But Dr. Bankole wrote here earlier on that when we're talking about infertility, because the reason why surrogacy is now a thing and why we're even talking about it is because there is infertility when somebody cannot do it themselves.
Mhm.
So she said, um, the rate at which infertility is right now is quite high, but we need to look at it from social aspect also, not only via pathological ways like poverty. Some have destroyed their tube due to unwanted pregnancy and they didn't do it right
Mhm.
because they cannot afford to do it right, or havoc done in the past, which has resulted in infertility. Then she wrote also that in addition to reason of infertility, abortion, early pregnancy, unwanted pregnancy, stuff like that are issues. I never thought about that. I never considered that because I've heard people using hangers
Oh my God.
to
Yeah.
do abortions in Nigeria.
Oh my God.
Actually, when I was in high school, we heard such tales. But hey, what do we know? We don't give it a thought that, oh, they used hanger to commit abortion, and they don't know what they could have destroyed that could have now caused, infertility and the need for surrogacy. So just to update us on what was in the chat box, Dr. Khadija, kindly unmute. Dr. Khadija is a pharmacist, doctor pharmacist.
Yes, good evening. Good evening. Thank you so much, Miss Yifat. Did I say your name correctly?
Yes,
Yeah.
Yifat, yes.
Yes, Yifat. My pleasure meeting you over the screen. Was this complex or what? Oh my goodness. This was so beautifully delivered. But it's a lot of moving parts, and you said you barely scratched the surface. Oh my God, I believe there's still so much to learn, but I just have I had so many questions coming to you as you were delivering it. Some of them you kind of touched on as it went on. So I probably have heard somewhere or in a movie or something, when there's a surrogate, whether compensated or otherwise. I just learned here today that even the spouse has to be compensated. are they restricted as far as sexual activity after she gets pregnant? I didn't hear you touch on that. I don't know if it's
Ah,
true.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'd be happy to touch on that. So first of all, the spouse doesn't get compensation. The spouse gets reimbursements. So the reimbursements that the spouse is going to get is typically just lost wages. So if they miss work because they're going to help the surrogate with the delivery, or if they miss work because they have to go to the fertility clinic to do blood tests, things like that, that they will be required to do, they will get reimbursements for that. Now, in terms of your other question with sexual activity, there is a restriction on it, actually. So, which it's amazing the world we live in these days. So, I actually, a lot of different restrictions. So, first of all, in terms of the surrogate, if she changes marital status, or even if she has any new sexual partner, she has to inform the intended parents as well as the fertility clinic. She's not allowed to have sexual activity with any new partner without first the clinic approving of them, because they have to undergo STD testing and FDA testing. Now, believe it or not, I actually had to put this in my surrogacy agreements. Also, even if they are married and they have additional sexual partners, and whether or not it's just a lifestyle, or if someone is cheating, it has to be in there. And if there's a husband, the husband signs that surrogacy agreement. So if he cheats, just for example, he will be held in breach of that agreement. So any sexual partners, no, you cannot have them without first a clinic approving. Now, in terms of any sexual activity, there is 100% a restriction on that at certain points during the pregnancy and before the pregnancy. So it depends on the doctor. That restriction will come from the doctor. The surrogacy agreement basically will say whatever the doctor says, and they have to follow those medical protocols and medical instructions. So typically you're looking at about 4 weeks or so prior to an embryo transfer. So at this point, the surrogate, we're tricking her body to thinking that she's pregnant, so that when we put the embryo inside, the body is technically already 2 weeks pregnant. So if she has intercourse, the chances of her getting pregnant with her own child is very high. So we have to be careful, and she's not allowed to have intercourse for certain amounts of time prior or even after the embryo transfer. Now, other than that, once there is a pregnancy, typically there's no restriction unless there is some type of risk that puts the surrogate at risk, where she has to have an additional restriction.
Thank you for that. My other question, I did say I had a couple questions. My second question, right? In as much as we know that the risk here in normal pregnancy includes even up to death. So if she, God forbid, this surrogate dies, maybe like during childbirth, I wouldn't want to say who's responsible, or how then does her husband, her family, looking at the psychology behind what she's doing, her family is going to suffer a loss. So what happens at that point?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So that is a risk that the surrogate herself assumes, that there's always a risk to pregnancy. And it's not even just pregnancy, it's also fertility medication. So it doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen where a surrogate does pass away. She dies due to either a risk during the pregnancy, or the last one that I recall, not in our agency. Thank God we never had a death in our agency. But there was a death of a surrogate who died from some type of complication, that her body had a reaction to the fertility medication that she was taking. So the way that it is handled is that before the surrogate even starts medication for an embryo transfer, she needs to have life insurance or an accidental death policy in place and everyone is different. In our agency, we say at least $750,000. Sometimes it's $1 million to make sure that God forbid something like that does happen, there is something in place at least to provide some type of protection for her family. So this is going to be her policy that is paid for by the intended parents, that she selects who the beneficiaries are. But it is zero, it's not a zero risk, right? So it is definitely like in the contract, we also, the surrogate will say that she understands the risks, that she in fact spoke to the medical professionals, to the reproductive endocrinologist about the risks and all the different risks that she is taking and proceeding with this.
Wow, there are definitely a lot of moving parts. I'm not gonna hijack the Q&A session, so I do still have some more questions. Maybe I can get your
No,
contact
go ahead.
information.
Ask the questions.
Okay.
Absolutely. I can also just say that this is also part of medical screening when the surrogate is going to go to the fertility clinic to undergo all the testing that they do for her. They also review all of her medical records. And I know at our at Surrogate Steps, our agency, we have 2 nurses actually on staff, and we review all the medical records before we even accept them into our program. So what we're looking for and what the fertility clinic is looking for is going to make sure that we're not going to clear someone who wants to be a surrogate if we think that she has something in her medical records that suggests that this is going to be a high risk pregnancy for her, or that it could potentially be putting the child at risk. So both the child and the surrogate, we don't want to put them at risk. So we want to make sure that the medical records are nice and clean, and that she is someone who can carry a pregnancy without taking an extra risk to herself. So we don't want someone with past red flags in their medical history that are going to be considered high risk pregnancy.
Yeah, I was almost at the point of being a compassionate surrogate to a friend, and she was running late. We're apart age-wise, just like 2 years in between. I was looking at my age also, and boom, I needed to undergo a gynecologic surgery. I'd reached out to her like, hey, you got to make up your mind because I'm about to like get rid of everything that you think I'm gonna help you with. And I may have to like connect you to her, her to you or something. I don't know what steps you want to take, moving on. And then in the area of life insurance, it looks like your agency is doing a lot in the medical field, in the social, what do they call it? Social worker field area, but then you're a law firm. Am I right? Because I
Yeah.
think she was
Yeah,
expert. So
she's a
it's so
lawyer,
much.
and Dr. Khadija, I
It's a
call her
lot.
doctor, and I'm right because you know what? She presented and sounded like a doctor.
Right.
Did she sound like an
He said
attorney to
first, I'm
you?
like, wait.
And
Wow,
all they do in
wow.
their office is, oh my gosh, medicine and, sound medicine too.
Hmm.
I'm really impressed.
Thank
It was
you.
beautifully delivered. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, you were asking about insurance, that they also do insurance. They
Do you
do
you do
personal.
insurance or you do this with an agent, another kind of agency on a different platform?
Yeah.
Who would
Yes.
they shop for?
Yeah, so my law firm is separate from the Surrogate Steps, our agency. So when we're looking at life insurance or an accidental death policy for the surrogate, they are different. Then we are not brokers ourselves. So what we want to do is make sure that we have one in place and we don't let anyone proceed with an embryo transfer or even to start medication for an embryo transfer without having that in place. And it's very important that we do that because the clinic just trusts that we're doing everything that needs to be done so that the clinic only needs to worry about the medical aspects of it, and the lawyers only worry about the law aspect of it because we always hire out the attorneys for our surrogacy agency. So we're just here to really make sure that everything is in place, that everyone is protected from literally every angle. One of those, making sure that life insurance accidental death policy is in place. So what we do is we have other insurance brokers that we work with that will work with them to put a policy in place. So there are actually a couple of brokers that they specialize in surrogacy. So one of them is called International Fertility Insurance that we work with a lot. And another one is also called Our Risk. We also work with them sometimes. And they both do the same thing where they will put a policy in place. And typically the policy we put in place is going to be the accidental death policy. Now, some states, so it will vary where the surrogate is from, because some states, like New York, for example, I think Maryland is another one of them off the top of my head, but I can't recall now. There are a couple of states where we cannot obtain an accidental death policy. They just won't let us do that because it's amazing. Every state is so different. So what we do in those cases is we have to obtain just a regular life insurance policy for the surrogate, but we always try to get at least $750,000. Now, that is our agency. I will say that surrogacy is very unregulated in the United States, just in the world. But surrogacy agencies are not regulated. Now, we happen to be a regulated agency because we are regulated by New York State. So New York State came out with regulating surrogacy agencies when they legalized surrogacy in New York. And they now can provide licenses to surrogacy agencies. But even though there are so many surrogacy agencies in the US, there are a few of them that are actually truly run by professionals, and even fewer that are actually licensed. So when we made the decision to say, okay, life insurance has to be a minimum of $750,000, that is also one of the requirements by New York State, that when you have a surrogate, we always required life insurance, but they required at least $750,000. So we raised it from $500,000 to $750,000, and sometimes it's even $1 million, just depending on the cost. Now, the nice thing about the accidental death versus the regular life insurance policy is that with the accidental death policies, we're able to get riders on top of just if the surrogate passes away, because truly, really, the chances are that she won't pass, right? But if there is a problem, it's not because someone dies, it's because someone has a situation happened to them, not necessarily death. So usually maybe they lose an organ, maybe they lost a reproductive organ, things like that. So whether or not they lose an ovary or they lose their uterus even, accidental death policy does allow us to get additional riders, that not just if she dies, but okay, what happens if this happens, or if she loses this organ, how much can she get additional money, because she will receive certain compensation from the parents for that, but can she also get compensation from the accidental death policy as well, which they do provide. So we're able to get those riders.
Absolutely. Now that makes sense when you talked about the riders, because I'm a broker as well, other than being a pharmacist. And I do know that the accidental death sometimes could be solely for you die by accident or auto crash. If it's not auto crash, then everything goes away. Your family doesn't get anything. So that makes sense with the writers. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
You know,
Dr.
oh, you're welcome. Thank you. You know, I learned a lot, like I said, but I'm familiar with, a, let me say, a little bit familiar with what goes on in some African countries, because I know one country in particular where the surrogate was in that country, and they actually sent the egg and the sperm of the actual parents to the country. There's a facility that is fertility clinic that handles this and handled everything. So the sperm and eggs at the real parents are the parents. And then they have the surrogate that they never talked to. There was a contract, but they never saw each other. They don't know each other. The surrogate does not know where they were, where they're coming from, and they don't know any, they didn't know anything about her also. So they flew in when it was time to have the baby. And the rule there is that the surrogate does not see the baby. The
Mm,
surrogate labors, delivers the baby, and doesn't see the baby because they said that it has happened in the past that the surrogate changes their mind.
wow. Okay.
And to avoid that, they don't see the surrogate would hear the baby cry, but the baby is removed
Hmm.
and given to the parents. And that's it for them. But these parents were able to bring their child into the US within a week or two.
Wow.
No, it's about 2 weeks, not a
Mhm.
week or two, maybe two. It wasn't 4 weeks, I'm sure of that. It was less than a month. They flew back into the US with, and they did the DNA. DNA showed that that was their child, and the US granted them urgent, whatever they needed to get the passport. They got the passport and flew back and brought their child back here.
Wonderful.
So what I learned today is deep. And having that knowledge of what happened, with the surrogacy out of the country was different. And I guess, like you said, everywhere had their rules, and even in the US, the rules are different. I saw on one of the slides you presented, you showed the areas, the states, and what states are good
Hmm.
to surrogacy, and Maryland is one of them.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah,
We
because
have,
I looked at with that.
yeah. Yeah. We
Thank
have
you.
service in Maryland. And I really just touched the surface. There's so much more. Yeah. Even insurance alone is huge. But I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to join you all and meet all of you. And thank you for having
Thank,
me.
thank you so much. But if you please put information on your book
Oh,
and your contacts in the chat box, that would be great, you
yes.
know, for people who are interested. And Dr. Dija, please introduce your friend to the agent.
I was gonna call her Dr.
Yifat.
Yifat.
Yeah.
I mean, I was gonna say Dr. Yifat. Okay.
And she's reasonable because, you will see what save money on surrogacy.
Yes.
It's what, it's what they say. It means she's been in this for 20 years,
Wow.
over 2 decades.
Hmm.
And that's what she has done, she said. And of course, she knows how much it costs and how much you pay them. A lot of people need this intervention. Thank you so very much. So, what would be your parting words for us tonight?
I guess I will end with something that my father always tells me, which is just do your best and let God do the rest.
Amen. Amen to that. Thank you so much. We appreciate you. And we definitely will keep in touch. because
So
we have people all the time that needs this service. And that's why I requested that so that I can send that to them directly. I won't like to bog you down with, text messages.
it's my pleasure. It's truly my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So till we meet again next week, everybody, please stay safe and enjoy, what is it? It's